In polite society, love is rarely spoken of. It is implied, measured, hidden behind etiquette and expectation. Here, affection is not declared loudly. It is noticed quietly. It waits. So if you believe love is not about being perfect, but about being recognized, then stay and listen. Before we continue with this story, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comment section where you are watching from. They did not say it unkindly. That was the cruelest part. They said it with softened voices, with sympathetic smiles, with the gentle certainty reserved for truths no longer worth disputing. Miss Eleanor Fairleigh was, past her prime. Not disgraced. Not undesirable. Simply finished, in the way society decides such things without ever announcing them. At 37, she had become someone people trusted, but no longer chose. And yet, in the candlelit rooms where youth determined worth, there was one man who never joined the murmurs. His Grace, Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe, the most reserved duke of the season. A man who did not chase. A man who did not explain. While others quietly moved on from Eleanor Fairleigh, the duke began to wait. Eleanor Fairleigh had learned how to exist without expectation. She stood where she would not interrupt. She smiled without hope attached to it. She listened, because listening required no invitation. There was dignity in knowing one's place. London society had not rejected her. It had done something far more precise. It had moved forward without her. Each season brought brighter laughter, younger faces, fresher dreams. Eleanor observed it all with quiet composure, believing acceptance was a form of peace. She did not envy the débutantes. She did not resent their futures. She had made her peace with being an observer. What she had not prepared for, what she could not explain, was why the Duke of Ashcombe always seemed to remain where she was. Not close enough to invite speculation. Not distant enough to be chance. When she took a seat, he lingered. When she departed, he delayed. He never offered flattery. Never encouraged hope. Never reached for what society insisted no longer belonged to her. And yet, in a world that had already decided Eleanor Fairleigh was no longer worth waiting for, Nathaniel Ashcombe waited anyway. Quietly. Deliberately. As though time itself had learned restraint from him. The season's first assembly at Lady Pemberton's was precisely what Eleanor had expected. Which was to say, it required nothing of her beyond presence and pleasant agreement. She arrived neither early nor late, wore a gown of sage green that flattered without announcing, and positioned herself near the terrace doors where the air moved more freely. The young ladies clustered near the musicians like flowers tilting toward light. Eleanor had once stood in such circles. Now she observed them with the mild interest one might give to a play seen many times before. Miss Fairleigh. Lady Pemberton approached with that particular warmth reserved for women who no longer posed romantic competition. "How well you look this evening." "You are kind, Lady Pemberton. I was just telling Mrs. Aldridge how fortunate we are to have your counsel. These young girls are forever asking my opinion on matters I cannot fathom. You have such a steady way about you." Steady. Eleanor had learned to hear what lived beneath such words. Steady meant reliable, dependable, safe. It meant one's passions, if they had ever existed, had been neatly folded away like winter clothing in summer. "I am happy to be of service," Eleanor said, because it was true, and because protest would have been undignified. Mrs. Aldridge joined them, her daughter Lydia attached to her arm like an ornament carefully selected for display. Lydia was 19, golden-haired, and possessed the breathless enthusiasm of someone who believed the world would continue surprising her kindly. "Miss Fairleigh, I was hoping you might advise Lydia on her embroidery. She is attempting roses and cannot make them look anything but mi Chopin." Eleanor smiled. "I would be delighted." This was her role now. Not participant, but guide. Not dancer, but chaperone. She had not chosen it, but she had learned its choreography well enough. Lydia glanced at her mother, then at Eleanor, and the flicker of pity in her young eyes was so brief Eleanor might have imagined it. Except she had seen that look before, too many times to miscount. "Mamma says you are wonderfully accomplished," Lydia offered, her voice straining toward kindness. "Your mother is generous. She says every young lady should hope to be as content as you are." Content. Another word that carried more than it announced. Mrs. Aldridge touched her daughter's hand with gentle correction. "Lydia, dear, perhaps Miss Fairleigh would prefer to speak of something other than domestic accomplishments." "Of course," Lydia said quickly. "Forgive me." There was nothing to forgive. The girl had meant no cruelty. That was precisely what made it cut. Across the room, Lord Blackwood was speaking with Mr. Hartley near the refreshment table. Both men were Eleanor's age, perhaps a year or two younger. She had known them since they were boys pulling at cravats and complaining of dancing lessons. Lord Blackwood caught her eye and smiled, not the smile he gave to Miss Caroline Astley, who stood 3 feet away in blush pink, but the smile one gave to a familiar, comfortable presence. He excused himself and crossed to her. "Miss Fairleigh, I trust you are well." "Quite well, thank you. I was telling Hartley just this morning that I cannot make sense of modern poetry. All feeling and no form. You always had an excellent sense for such things. What is your view?" He asked as one might ask a respected tutor. There was admiration in it, but not the kind that made a woman feel seen as anything beyond useful. Eleanor answered thoughtfully, because she did have opinions on poetry, and because there was no harm in sharing them. Lord Blackwood listened, nodded, thanked her for her insight, and returned to Mr. Hartley with the satisfied air of someone who had just confirmed a point. She did not blame him. She blamed nothing and no one, because blame required the belief that something had been taken unfairly. But society had never promised her permanence. It had simply followed its nature, the way water flows downhill and flowers turn toward the sun. Mrs. Aldridge reappeared, this time steering her daughter more deliberately toward the center of the room, where younger gentlemen congregated. She paused only to touch Eleanor's arm with real affection. "You must join us for tea next week, Miss Fairleigh. Lydia would so benefit from your influence." "Your influence. Not your company. Not your friendship. Your steadying, sensible, entirely non-threatening influence." "I would be honored." And she would go. She would sit in their drawing room and admire Lydia's embroidery and offer thoughts on whatever small troubles the girl wished to share. She would be valuable in precisely the way society now valued her. The evening continued in its predictable rhythm. She danced once, with Mr. Hartley, who spoke to her of his sister's upcoming wedding with the ease of someone unburdened by any thought that Eleanor might once have hoped for her own. She congratulated him. She asked after his family. She performed her part beautifully. When she found herself alone near the terrace doors again, watching the younger women laugh and lean and hope with a kind of unself-conscious brightness that belonged only to those who still believed they had time, Eleanor felt something she had worked very hard not to name. Not envy, precisely. Not bitterness. Something quieter. Something that sat beneath her carefully maintained composure like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream, visible, if one looked closely, but easily ignored. She had learned not to look closely. Lady Pemberton passed by with 2 other matrons, their voices low but not quite low enough. Such a shame about Eleanor Fairleigh. A shame. That she never married. She was quite lovely once. She is still handsome. Of course, but you know what I mean. Eleanor did know. She knew precisely. The evening ended as all such evenings ended now. She collected her wrap, thanked her hostess, and stepped into the cool night air where her carriage waited. Inside, she sat in darkness and silence, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed even though no one was watching. She had made her peace with this. She had. She told herself so as London rolled past her window, as the lamplights blurred together, as another season began without her. And if some part of her, some small, stubborn part, still remembered what it felt like to be looked at as though one's presence mattered beyond utility or kindness, she did not allow herself to dwell on it. Dwelling changed nothing. Dignity required acceptance. So Eleanor accepted. The Duke of Ashcombe arrived at Lady Pemberton's second assembly exactly when propriety dictated, neither fashionably late nor eagerly early. Eleanor noticed this only because she had begun noticing many things she told herself did not matter. He was a man constructed of restraint. Where other gentlemen gestured broadly or laughed with their whole bodies, Nathaniel Ashcombe moved with the economy of someone who had learned to occupy space without disturbing it. His greetings were polite. His bows were precise. His expression remained so carefully neutral that Eleanor suspected it required significant effort to maintain. She had known of him for 3 seasons. Known of, not known. He attended the necessary functions, danced the required dances, and departed without scandal or memorable incident. If society spoke of him at all, it was to note his title, his wealth, and his remarkable ability to discourage speculation about either. "The Duke never looks as though he wishes to be anywhere," Lady Pemberton had once remarked, not unkindly. "One wonders why he bothers attending at all." Eleanor understood the wondering. She also understood the bothering. Duty did not require enthusiasm. It only required presence. This evening, the Duke stood near the far wall in conversation with Lord Wycliffe, his posture suggesting attention while his gaze suggested nothing at all. He did not scan the room. He did not seek. He simply existed within the scene with the same dispassionate courtesy one might show to a portrait one neither admired nor disliked. Eleanor returned her attention to Miss Astley, who was describing her new mare with the kind of enthusiasm that made even horses sound romantic. "She is the most beautiful creature, Miss Fairleigh. Dappled grey with the gentlest disposition. Papa says I may ride her in the park if the weather holds." "How lovely for you. You must come watch me ride. I would value your opinion tremendously." Eleanor smiled, because Miss Astley meant it sincerely, and because being valued for one's opinion was still being valued. When Miss Astley was claimed for a dance by young Mr. Thornton, Eleanor found herself temporarily without purpose. She moved toward the refreshment table, not because she wanted refreshment, but because standing near food gave one something to do with one's hands. The Duke was already there. Not at the table precisely, but near enough that approaching would create proximity. Eleanor hesitated, a pause so brief no one else would have registered it, then continued forward. She had as much right to a glass of lemonade as anyone. She reached for a glass. His hand moved at precisely the same moment toward the same vessel. Both withdrew. "Forgive me," Eleanor said. "Not at all." His voice carried no inflection, no warmth, but also no coldness. It was simply sound shaped into words. He gestured for her to take the glass. She did. He selected another. For a moment they stood in the particular silence that exists between strangers who have acknowledged each other's existence but have no clear reason to continue doing so. Eleanor expected him to excuse himself. Men of his station did not linger near women of no romantic consequence. He did not excuse himself. Neither did he speak. He simply remained where he was, glass in hand, gaze directed vaguely toward the dancers, his expression revealing absolutely nothing about whether he found their company pleasant, tedious, or entirely beneath his notice. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortably, but noticeably. Eleanor sipped her lemonade and wondered if she should offer some polite observation about the weather or the music. But the Duke's entire bearing suggested a man who did not require conversation to fill silence, and she found herself reluctant to perform pleasantries for someone who might not want them. "The musicians are competent this evening," she said finally, because the silence had become a thing between them. "Yes." Nothing more. Just agreement, delivered without embellishment. Most men would have elaborated. Compared this ensemble to others. Expressed an opinion about the choice of pieces. The Duke simply confirmed her observation and fell silent again. It should have been awkward. It was not. Eleanor found herself studying the dancers, really studying them, rather than pretending to. Miss Caroline Astley laughed at something Mr. Thornton said. Mrs. Aldridge watched her daughter with the focused intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. Lord Blackwood partnered a young woman whose name Eleanor could not recall, both moving through the steps with the practiced ease of people who had danced together many times. "You do not dance, Miss Fairleigh." The Duke's question arrived so quietly she almost missed it. "Not this evening." "May I ask why?" There were several acceptable answers. She was fatigued. She preferred to observe. She had already enjoyed one dance and did not wish to monopolize the floor. What she said instead was closer to truth. "No one has asked." The Duke turned his head, not fully, but enough that she understood she had his attention. "I find that surprising." It was not flattery. His tone remained entirely neutral, as though he were remarking on the temperature or the hour. And yet something in the observation made Eleanor look at him more carefully. He was not handsome in the way young men were handsome. His features were too severe for charm, too composed for warmth. But there was a quality to his face that suggested thought happened behind it, constant, deliberate thought that he had no intention of sharing. "You are kind to say so, Your Grace." "I am not kind. I am accurate." Before Eleanor could parse that statement, Mrs. Aldridge approached with Lydia in tow, her smile brightening when she saw the Duke. "Your Grace, what a pleasure. I do not believe you have been properly introduced to my daughter, Miss Lydia Aldridge." The Duke bowed. "Miss Aldridge." Lydia curtsied with the slightly exaggerated grace of someone recently taught how. "Your Grace." Mrs. Aldridge's intentions were transparent as window glass. Eleanor recognized the angle of the mother's body, the way she positioned Lydia just so, the brightness in her voice that suggested this was a significant moment being carefully orchestrated. Lydia was just saying how much she hoped to dance this evening. The next set is about to begin. The Duke regarded Lydia with the same neutral attention he had given everything else. "Miss Aldridge dances, then?" "Oh yes, Your Grace. She is quite accomplished." A beat of silence. Mrs. Aldridge's smile held. Lydia's cheeks pinked slightly. The Duke inclined his head. "I wish you an enjoyable evening, Miss Aldridge." He did not ask her to dance. Mrs. Aldridge's smile flickered but recovered. "Of course, Your Grace. We would not wish to impose on your time." She steered Lydia away with practiced efficiency, already scanning the room for more promising prospects. Eleanor had watched this scene play out before with other gentlemen and other daughters. Usually the rejection was softened with some excuse, a prior commitment, an injury, fatigue. The Duke had offered nothing but polite dismissal. "You did not wish to dance with Miss Aldridge," Eleanor observed quietly. "No. She is lovely." "Yes. And accomplished. Her mother believes so." Eleanor felt something close to amusement. "You do not." "I have no opinion on Miss Aldridge's accomplishments. I have no desire to form one." It was possibly the most honest thing Eleanor had heard a gentleman say in months. The Duke finished his lemonade, set the glass down with careful precision, and finally turned to face Eleanor fully. His gaze met hers, direct, unreadable, and entirely without the warmth or interest society taught men to perform. "Good evening, Miss Fairleigh." "Good evening, Your Grace." He walked away without flourish, his departure as measured as his arrival. Eleanor remained by the refreshment table, glass still in hand, aware that something had happened though she could not name what. The Duke had not flirted. He had not complimented. He had not demonstrated any particular interest in her beyond brief, polite conversation. And yet, he had not asked Lydia Aldridge to dance. He had not softened his refusal with pretty lies. He had stood beside Eleanor without excuse or explanation, as though her presence required neither justification nor apology. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this as she watched him speak briefly with Lord Wycliffe near the door. As he collected his hat and gloves from the attending footman. As he departed into the night without once looking back at the room he was leaving. It meant nothing. Eleanor had learned not to construct hope from small courtesies. She had learned this lesson well. The library at Hartfield House was not intended for guests. Eleanor knew this, which was precisely why she had slipped inside during Lady Hartfield's afternoon gathering. The drawing-room had grown overcrowded, the air thick with perfume and competing conversations, and Eleanor had developed a talent for disappearing without causing offense. She ran her fingers along the spines of books she would never be permitted to borrow, reading titles in the dim light filtering through heavy curtains. Poetry, philosophy, a complete set of botanical illustrations that made her pause with genuine longing. "You prefer plants to people, Miss Fairleigh?" Eleanor turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I prefer quiet to noise, Your Grace. The plants are incidental." "I see." He stepped inside, closing the door partially behind him, enough for propriety, not enough to trap her. "I also found the drawing room somewhat populous. Lady Hartfield does enjoy a full house." "She does." He moved to the shelves opposite her, studying the titles with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than polite pretense. Eleanor waited for him to make some excuse and depart. He had found his quiet. There was no reason for him to remain. He remained. The silence that settled between them was the same quality as before, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply present. Eleanor returned her attention to the botanical illustrations, carefully turning pages she had no right to touch. "You enjoy botany," the Duke observed after several minutes. It was not a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "I find it soothing. Plants follow rules. If you provide the correct conditions, they respond predictably. Unlike people. Precisely unlike people." She expected him to probe further, to ask what had disappointed her about people or to offer some platitude about human nature. Instead, he simply nodded once and returned to his examination of the shelves. They stood in separate silence for what might have been 5 minutes or 15. Time moved differently in quiet spaces. Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did at social gatherings, not because the Duke was particularly warm or welcoming, but because he asked nothing of her. No performance. No pleasantries. Just coexistence. "The third volume is missing," he said eventually. Eleanor looked up. "I beg your pardon." He gestured to the botanical set. "You are holding Volume 2. Volume 4 is on the shelf. Volume 3 appears to be absent." She checked. He was correct. How terribly frustrating. Indeed. Another silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, "I have the complete set at Ashcombe Hall. The illustrations in Volume 3 are particularly fine. Alpine flora." Eleanor looked at him. He was not looking at her. His gaze remained fixed on the shelves, his posture unchanged. It was not an invitation. He had not offered to show her. He had simply stated a fact. "Alpine flora," she repeated softly. "How lovely." "Yes." Nothing more. The door opened wider and Miss Caroline Astley peered inside, her expression brightening when she saw them. "Oh, I wondered where everyone had disappeared to. Miss Fairleigh, Your Grace." "Miss Astley." Eleanor stepped away from the shelves. The Duke bowed. "Miss Astley. We are about to have tea. You must both join us." Caroline's enthusiasm was genuine and somewhat infectious. "Mrs. Pemberton is going to sing. She has been practicing for weeks." Eleanor had heard Mrs. Pemberton sing before. The woman's enthusiasm far exceeded her talent. "That sounds delightful." "Your Grace." Caroline looked at the Duke hopefully. "I would not wish to disappoint Mrs. Pemberton." It was the most diplomatic non-answer Eleanor had ever heard. Caroline, fortunately, took it as agreement and led them both back toward the drawing room with the determination of someone herding reluctant sheep. The afternoon proceeded as such afternoons always did. Mrs. Pemberton sang with great feeling and questionable pitch. Lord Blackwood discussed his recent acquisition of a new hunting dog. Miss Lydia Aldridge demonstrated her improved embroidery technique, which had indeed improved since Eleanor last saw it. Eleanor noticed, because she had learned to notice everything, that the Duke positioned himself near the window. Not close enough to her to invite comment. Not far enough to seem deliberately distant. Simply present. When Mrs. Pemberton launched into her second piece, a complicated Italian aria that suffered greatly in translation, the Duke's gaze drifted toward Eleanor. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. His expression did not change. He did not smile or grimace or offer any indication of his thoughts on Mrs. Pemberton's musical interpretation. And yet Eleanor knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent too many afternoons pretending to enjoy questionable entertainment, that he was thinking precisely what she was thinking. She looked away before anything resembling amusement could show on her face. 3 days later, at the Mercers' evening card party, Eleanor found herself seated at a table with Lady Pemberton, Mr. Hartley, and Mrs. Devon. They were playing whist, which Eleanor enjoyed because it required concentration rather than conversation. The Duke was across the room at a different table. Eleanor was aware of this in the same way she was aware of the temperature of the room or the brightness of the candles, background information her mind catalogued without permission. When the hands changed and partners rotated, Mr. Hartley excused himself to refresh his drink. Mrs. Devon leaned toward Lady Pemberton to discuss some bit of gossip about an absent friend. Eleanor studied her cards, already planning her strategy for the next round. "You play conservatively, Miss Fairleigh." She looked up. The Duke had somehow materialized in Mr. Hartley's vacant seat. "I play to win, Your Grace." The two are not always synonymous. Perhaps not. But I have found that bold plays often result in bold losses. And you prefer modest victories to spectacular failures. I prefer not to fail spectacularly, yes. Something that might have been the ghost of amusement flickered across his features, so briefly Eleanor could not be certain she had seen it at all. Mr. Hartley returned, looking mildly surprised to find his seat occupied. The Duke rose immediately. "Forgive me. I was merely passing by." He returned to his own table without looking back. Eleanor won the next 3 hands. It became a pattern, though Eleanor refused to call it that. Patterns implied intention, and she could not afford to assume intention where none might exist. But at Lady Thornton's musicale, the Duke arrived after she did and departed before she left, and in the time between, he remained in the same general area of the room, never beside her, never ignoring her, simply there. At the Worthington ball, he did not ask her to dance. But when Lord Blackwood made some comment about the refreshments being inferior to last season's fare, the Duke's gaze found Eleanor's across the room, and she knew that he remembered her observation from weeks ago that Lady Worthington had changed caterers and the new selection was indeed disappointing. He remembered. He did not approach her, did not reference it, did not do anything at all. But he remembered. At the botanical lecture sponsored by Lady Harrington, an event Eleanor attended because she genuinely wanted to, not because society required it, she found the Duke already seated 3 rows ahead. The lecture was sparsely attended. Most of the ton found detailed discussions of plant reproduction tedious. When the speaker mentioned alpine flora, the Duke's posture shifted slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Eleanor noticed. After the lecture, as guests filtered out into the gallery for refreshments, Eleanor found herself studying a large illustrated chart of root systems. She was aware, peripherally, that the Duke stood nearby examining a case of preserved specimens. "Did you find the lecture informative, Miss Fairleigh?" She had not heard him approach. "Very much so. Though I suspect we are in the minority. The majority often prefers entertainment to education. And you do not." "I prefer substance to spectacle." Eleanor looked at the chart, tracking the intricate network of roots spreading beneath an illustrated oak. Substance is often less visible than spectacle. That does not make it less valuable. She turned to face him. He was looking at the root system chart, not at her. "No," she agreed quietly. "It does not." They stood in silence, studying roots together while other guests laughed and gossiped in the adjacent room. He did not compliment her, did not move closer, did not promise anything or declare anything or suggest anything at all. But when Lady Harrington announced that refreshments were being served, and Eleanor turned to join the others, the Duke spoke once more. Volume 3. Alpine Flora. The illustrations truly are remarkable. Eleanor paused. "I am certain they are, Your Grace. Perhaps someday you might see them. Perhaps. Not an invitation. Not a promise. Simply a possibility offered into the space between them, as careful and measured as everything else about him." Eleanor carried that perhaps home with her. She turned it over in her mind as her carriage rolled through darkened streets. She examined it from every angle, searching for meaning she might have imagined. She told herself, as she had told herself many times before, that it meant nothing. But that night, alone in her room, she allowed herself to wonder, just for a moment, why a man who did nothing would choose to do nothing so consistently in her vicinity. Why he would remember alpine flora and inferior refreshments and the way she played cards. Why he would offer perhaps when he could simply have offered nothing at all. She did not have an answer. Neither, she suspected, would anyone else. Lady Hartfield's garden party was intended to celebrate the arrival of her niece from Bath. Miss Georgiana Hartfield was 22, accomplished in all the ways that mattered, and possessed the kind of effortless beauty that required neither artifice nor maintenance. She had dark curls that caught the light, eyes that sparkled with genuine warmth, and a laugh that made even mundane observations sound delightful. Eleanor liked her immediately, which made everything worse. "Miss Fairleigh, you simply must meet Georgiana." Lady Hartfield steered her niece toward Eleanor with evident pride. "She has heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Eleanor said, offering her hand. Georgiana's smile was radiant. "Aunt Catherine says you are the most sensible woman in London. I have been longing to meet you." Sensible. There was that word again. "Your aunt is too generous. She says you give the best advice on everything from literature to household management. I am quite hopeless at both and desperately need guidance." Eleanor doubted very much that this lovely creature was hopeless at anything, but she made appropriate noises of encouragement. Georgiana chattered on with unaffected enthusiasm about Bath, about London, about how overwhelming the season was and how grateful she was to have her aunt's support. "And I understand the Duke of Ashcombe is a particular friend of my uncle's," Georgiana added, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Aunt Catherine says he is impossibly difficult to know, but I am determined to make a good impression." Something cold settled in Eleanor's chest. "I am certain you will." "Do you know him well, Miss Fairleigh?" "Not well, no. We are merely acquaintances." "Oh." Georgiana looked almost disappointed. "I had hoped you might tell me something of his character. All I hear is that he is reserved and very proper and has the most exacting standards." "That sounds accurate enough." "Is he truly as severe as everyone says?" Eleanor thought of shared silences in libraries, of alpine flora and remembered details, of perhaps offered like a gift he would not name. "He is deliberate," she said carefully. "I do not believe he does anything without consideration." "How intriguing." Georgiana's eyes brightened. "Aunt Catherine says he needs someone lively to draw him out of himself. Someone young and spirited enough to make him smile." Young. The word landed precisely where it was meant to. Eleanor managed a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "That sounds like excellent reasoning." The Duke arrived an hour later, and Eleanor watched, because she could not help watching, as Lady Hartfield orchestrated an introduction with the subtle precision of a general positioning troops. Georgiana was placed directly in his path. The sun illuminated her from behind like a painting of youth itself. Lady Hartfield made the introduction with barely contained delight. "Your Grace, may I present my niece, Miss Georgiana Hartfield, newly arrived from Bath." The Duke bowed. "Miss Hartfield." Georgiana curtsied with natural grace. "Your Grace. What a pleasure." Eleanor stood 20 feet away, ostensibly admiring Lady Hartfield's roses. She was close enough to observe, far enough to pretend she was not observing. "I understand you are acquainted with my uncle," Georgiana said, her voice carrying that easy confidence possessed by women who had never doubted their welcome. "Lord Hartfield and I have been friends many years. He speaks very highly of you. As does everyone, really." though they all say you are terribly difficult to know." The Duke's expression did not change. "Do they? I hope that is not true. I should very much like to know you better." It was bold without being improper, flirtatious without being forward. Exactly the kind of thing a young woman could say and be admired for her spirit. Eleanor forced her attention back to the roses. They were yellow. She had always found yellow roses somewhat insipid, though she could not articulate why. "Miss Hartfield appears to have made quite an impression on his Grace," Lady Pemberton observed, materializing at Eleanor's elbow. "They make a striking pair, do they not?" Eleanor did not look. "I had not noticed." "Oh, come now. Everyone has noticed. She is precisely what he needs, young enough to be mold, spirited enough to be interesting. And her dowry is quite respectable, I understand." "How fortunate." "Lord Hartfield is already speaking of it as a settled thing. You know how men are when they get an idea in their heads." Eleanor knew. She knew precisely. Mrs. Aldridge joined them, Lydia trailing behind. "Are we discussing Miss Hartfield and the Duke? Such a perfect match. I was just saying to Lydia that this is how it ought to be, youth with youth, liveliness with gravity, a balancing of temperaments." "And she is not yet old enough to be set in her ways," Lady Pemberton added. "A man like the Duke needs a wife who can adapt to his requirements." Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. "If you will excuse me, I believe I need some water." She walked toward the refreshment table with measured steps. Not fleeing. Simply moving. There was a difference. Behind her, she heard Lady Pemberton's voice, not quite lowered enough. "Poor Eleanor. She has always been so dignified about her situation. Never a word of complaint." "It must be difficult," Mrs. Aldridge agreed, "watching another season pass. But she has made her peace with it, I think." "One must, eventually." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a glass. She steadied it through sheer force of will. Across the garden, Georgiana laughed at something the Duke said. The sound carried like bells. The Duke's expression remained neutral, but he had not walked away. He stood there, tolerating her brightness in a way that suggested he did not find it entirely objectionable. He had never walked away from Eleanor either. But he had never stood in sunlight with her while society watched and approved. "Miss Fairleigh." Lord Blackwood appeared beside her. "You look rather pale. Are you quite well?" "Perfectly well, thank you." "This heat can be oppressive. Perhaps you should sit in the shade." There it was again. Concern. Kindness. The gentle care one offered to someone fragile and fading. "I am well," she repeated, more firmly. Lord Blackwood looked unconvinced but did not press. "If you insist. Though you really should take better care. At our age, we must be more cautious about such things." Our age. As though 37 and 40 were the same country, and both of them had already emigrated there permanently. Eleanor excused herself and found a bench partially concealed by hedges. She Saturday. She breathed. She reminded herself that she had known this would happen eventually. The Duke would marry. Of course he would. Men of his station always did. And he would marry someone young. Someone lovely. Someone who still had time. Someone who was not her. She had been foolish to notice his presence. Foolish to catalogue his small observations and careful words. Foolish to turn perhaps into something it had never been meant to be. He had been kind. That was all. Kind in the same distant, measured way he was kind to everyone. She had simply been lonely enough to mistake restraint for attention. Through the hedge, she could hear Lady Hartfield's voice, bright with satisfaction. "Georgiana dear, you must show His Grace the East Garden. The peonies are particularly fine this year." "I should be delighted, Aunt Catherine." "Your Grace." A pause. Then the Duke's voice, careful as always, "If you wish." "If you wish. Not if I wish." The distinction mattered. Or perhaps Eleanor was simply searching for distinctions that no longer existed. She sat on the bench until the light changed, until the worst of the afternoon heat had passed, until she was certain her face would show nothing but pleasant composure. Then she rose, smoothed her skirts, and returned to the party. Georgiana and the Duke had returned from the East Garden. They stood near the fountain while Lady Hartfield introduced the girl to other guests, each introduction accompanied by subtle praise. So accomplished, so charming, so exactly what society valued. The Duke's gaze moved across the garden and found Eleanor. For 3 seconds, she counted, he looked at her. His expression revealed nothing. No recognition. No acknowledgement. Nothing that suggested the library at Hartfield House or Alpine Flora or any of the small, private moments she had been foolish enough to collect. Then Georgiana said something, and his attention returned to her. Eleanor understood. She had always understood, really. She had simply allowed herself to forget what she knew. That evening, as a carriage carried her home through streets blurred by failing light, Eleanor made a decision. Not a dramatic one. She was too old for drama, too tired for grand gestures. She would simply stop attending so many functions. No one would notice. Or rather, they would notice in the way one noticed the absence of furniture that had always been present but never essential, a vague sense that something was missing, followed quickly by the realization that the room looked better without it. She would occupy less space, make fewer appearances, allow society to forget her gradually, the way one forgets a name that was never quite important enough to remember. It was not defeat. It was acceptance. Dignity required knowing when to withdraw. And Eleanor had always had dignity. It was all she had left. Eleanor stopped attending the Mercers' weekly card parties. Then Lady Thornton's musicales. Then the botanical lectures she had genuinely enjoyed. She told herself it was practical. The season was exhausting, and she had never been essential to anyone's guest list. Her absence would create no gap that others could not fill more pleasantly. Lady Pemberton noticed first. "We have missed you these past weeks, Miss Fairleigh. I do hope you are not unwell." "Merely fatigued. The season has been rather full." Of course. One must pace oneself. At our, Lady Pemberton caught herself. That is, rest is very important. Eleanor smiled as though she had not heard what was almost said. At our age. At your age. The words hovered in the space between them, polite and lethal. She declined 3 invitations in a single week. It became easier each time. No one questioned her too closely. No one insisted she reconsider. They simply accepted her withdrawal with the same gentle understanding they had accepted everything else about her diminished place in their world. She did not ask about the Duke. Did not inquire whether he still attended this function or that gathering. It was none of her concern, and she refused to make it her concern. Mrs. Aldridge mentioned, quite casually over tea, that His Grace had been seen often in Miss Hartfield's company. Such a suitable match. Lord Hartfield is beside himself with satisfaction, though nothing has been formally announced, of course. But these things take time, and the Duke is so very particular. How nice for them, Eleanor murmured. She meant it. Or she meant to mean it. The distinction was becoming harder to maintain. What she did not know, what she could not know, having removed herself from observation, was that the Duke of Ashcombe had begun appearing at gatherings with unusual frequency. Not all gatherings. His attendance remained selective. But Lord Wycliffe had remarked to his wife that Ashcombe seemed to have developed sudden opinions about which events merited his presence. He asked specifically whether Miss Fairleigh would be at the Worthingtons' dinner. Lady Wycliffe reported to Mrs. Devon, who reported to Lady Pemberton, who found the detail curious but not remarkable enough to warrant particular attention. "Perhaps he wishes to consult her about something," Lady Pemberton suggested. "She is very sensible." The Duke arrived at the Worthingtons' dinner precisely on time. He remained for the entire evening, which was notable only because he typically departed early from such functions. When the ladies withdrew after dinner, he did not linger long over port but rejoined the drawing-room with what appeared to be purpose. Miss Fairleigh was not present. He stayed another 40 minutes before making his excuses. At Lady Harrington's salon, an intimate gathering for those interested in literature and conversation, the Duke appeared unexpectedly. Lady Harrington was so surprised she nearly forgot to greet him properly. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. I did not realize you had an interest in contemporary poetry. I find I am developing one." He accepted a seat, declined refreshments, and remained throughout the entire discussion. His contributions were minimal but thoughtful. When the evening concluded, he was among the last to depart. Miss Fairleigh had sent her regrets that morning. Lord Hartfield hosted a supper for intimate friends. The Duke accepted the invitation, which was not unusual. He and Hartfield were old friends. What was unusual was his inquiry, carefully casual, about the guest list. "Will Miss Fairleigh be attending?" "Eleanor? No, I believe she is otherwise engaged. My wife mentioned something about her declining. Why do you ask?" "Mere curiosity." The Duke arrived on time. He remained exactly as long as courtesy required. When Georgiana maneuvered herself beside him in the drawing-room, her smile bright with encouraged hope, he was polite. Distant. He answered her questions with the same measured courtesy he showed everyone. But when she laughed at something, that pretty, crystalline laugh that usually made men lean closer, the Duke did not lean. He remained precisely where he was, his expression unchanged, and after a moment he excused himself to speak with Lord Hartfield about some matter of mutual business. Georgiana's smile dimmed slightly. Lady Hartfield frowned. "I do not understand him," Georgiana confessed to her aunt later. "He is never unkind, but he is never anything. It is like speaking to a very polite statue. He is reserved, dear. Some men require more patience." "I have been patient. I have been lively and agreeable and interested in everything he says, which is not much because he barely says anything at all. I do not think he even sees me." Lady Hartfield patted her hand. "Give it time." But time was producing unusual results. The Duke began declining invitations. Not all of them, that would have been remarked upon, but enough that his social secretary felt compelled to mention it. "Your Grace, Lady Pemberton has invited you to her card party next Thursday. Send my regrets. And the Thorntons' ball on Saturday. I will attend." "Very good, Your Grace." A pause. "May I ask, that is, I am simply trying to understand your preferences. Lady Pemberton's gatherings are generally quite small and select, while the Thorntons' ball will be rather crowded." "I am aware." His secretary waited for elaboration. None came. What the secretary did not know was that the Duke had made his own inquiries. Discreet ones. Never asking directly about Miss Fairleigh but allowing her name to surface naturally in conversation before noting, with careful attention, who mentioned seeing her where. The Thorntons' ball. Mrs. Devon had mentioned, quite casually, that Eleanor Fairleigh had accepted their invitation. One of the few she had accepted recently, in fact. The Duke arrived at the Thorntons' ball and positioned himself where he could observe the entrance without appearing to observe anything in particular. Guests arrived in clusters, announced and absorbed into the glittering crowd. Miss Fairleigh did not arrive. He waited an hour. Then another. He danced once, with the hostess's daughter, because refusing would have been rude. He accepted a glass of wine he did not drink. He remained at the ball until it became clear that she was not coming. Only then did he depart. In his carriage, he sat in darkness and considered the facts with the same deliberate analysis he applied to estate matters and political decisions. Miss Fairleigh had withdrawn. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement or explanation. She had simply ceased appearing where she once appeared. He understood withdrawal. He had practiced it most of his life. But her withdrawal felt different. It felt like something ending before it had ever properly begun. The following week, he attended the Aldridge's afternoon tea. A small gathering. Mostly women. Not the sort of function he typically accepted. Mrs. Aldridge was transparently delighted by his presence. "Your Grace, what an honor. We so rarely see you at afternoon events. I found myself with unexpected leisure time." Lydia was urged forward to pour his tea. She did so with careful attention, clearly instructed by her mother on this exact scenario. The Duke accepted the cup with thanks and remained standing near the window, surveying the room with apparent disinterest. Miss Fairleigh was not present. "I had hoped Miss Fairleigh might join us," he said, the words carefully neutral. "I understand she is a frequent guest." Mrs. Aldridge's expression flickered with something, surprise, perhaps, or confusion. "Oh, yes, Eleanor usually attends, but she sent her regrets this week. She has been rather retiring lately. I do hope she is well. I am certain she is simply managing her time wisely." "Yes, quite." Mrs. Aldridge still looked puzzled. "May I ask, that is, do you have some matter you wish to discuss with her?" "Merely a question about botanical illustrations. Nothing of consequence." It was a lie. A small one, but enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything that mattered. He stayed exactly 20 minutes, long enough to be polite, not long enough to encourage speculation, and departed. Over the following fortnight, a pattern emerged that would have been visible to anyone paying close attention. Fortunately, no one was paying close enough attention. The Duke appeared at functions Miss Fairleigh had once attended regularly. He remained longer than his custom at gatherings where he thought she might be. He delayed departures, lingering in rooms as though waiting for something he would not name. When Georgiana Hartfield was seated beside him at Lord Wycliffe's dinner, she made every effort to engage him in conversation. She was witty. She was warm. She referenced books he had mentioned in passing, demonstrating she had been paying attention. He was unfailingly polite. He was also clearly, utterly, somewhere else. "I do not understand what I am doing wrong," Georgiana told her aunt that night, her frustration finally breaking through her natural optimism. "He is never rude. But he is never present. It is as though he is waiting for someone who is not there." Lady Hartfield had no answer to give. Across London, in a quieter house with fewer visitors and less consequence, Eleanor Fairleigh sat in her drawing-room with a book she was not reading. She had convinced herself that withdrawal was peace. That absence was dignity. She did not know that in ballrooms and drawing-rooms and garden parties across the city, a man who never explained himself was rearranging his entire social calendar around the shape of her absence. She did not know he was waiting. She only knew that she had finally learned to stop. 3 weeks of carefully maintained absence had taught Eleanor something valuable. Invisibility, once achieved, was remarkably easy to maintain. No one demanded explanations. No one questioned her sudden preference for quiet evenings at home. The invitations still arrived, fewer now, but still present, and she declined them with brief, polite notes that offered no details because details would have required lies, and Eleanor had promised herself she would not lie. She was simply tired. That was true enough. Tired of performing pleasantness for people who saw her as furniture. Tired of watching youth be rewarded for existing while experience was filed away as something finished. Tired of mistaking courtesy for connection. That last one hurt most because it revealed her own foolishness most clearly. She had thought, no, she had not thought, she had felt, that the Duke's attention meant something. His remembering of small details. His consistent presence in her vicinity. His perhaps offered like a door left slightly ajar. But men like the Duke did not choose women like her. That was simply fact, as undeniable as gravity or the movement of tides. He would choose Georgiana or someone like her, someone whose future still stretched forward rather than someone whose best years had already been catalogued and dismissed. Eleanor had made peace with this. She had made peace with many things. What she had not anticipated was how much that peace would feel like grief. She spent her mornings in the garden. Her small London house had a square of green behind it, barely large enough to be called a garden but sufficient for her purposes. She planted herbs. Rosemary for remembrance, though she tried not to consider what she was meant to remember. Lavender for its scent and its practicality. Time because it asked for little and gave much. Plants were honest. They did not pretend to need her while slowly edging her toward irrelevance. They simply grew or died based on whether she provided what they required. She preferred their company to most people's. In the afternoons, she read books she had meant to read for years but had never found time for because social obligations had consumed her hours. Now she had time. Remarkable amounts of it. Time that stretched out before her like an empty room she was expected to furnish with something meaningful. She tried not to think about the Duke. She failed, frequently, but she tried. At night, she lay awake and reconstructed each moment she had mistaken for significance. The library at Hartfield House. The botanical lecture. His observation about her card-playing strategy. His mention of Volume 3 and Alpine Flora. She had built a structure from these moments. A careful architecture of maybe and perhaps and what if. And then she had watched that structure collapse the moment Georgiana Hartfield arrived with her youth and laughter and uncomplicated suitability. The Duke had not been unkind. That was important to remember. He had never promised anything. Never suggested anything. Never offered anything beyond perhaps, which was not an offer at all but merely a word that acknowledged possibility without committing to it. She had done this to herself. She had taken restraint and made it romance. Taken patience and called it devotion. She had been so starved for recognition that she had mistaken simple courtesy for something it had never been. Lady Pemberton called on her in the 4th week of her withdrawal. Eleanor had not expected visitors. She was in her garden, dirt under her fingernails, hair unpinned, wearing a dress she would never have worn in company. She looked, she realized with dim horror, exactly like what she was, a woman who had stopped trying. Eleanor, dear. Lady Pemberton swept into the garden with the confidence of someone who had never been told she was unwelcome anywhere. I have been dreadfully worried about you. There is no need for worry. I am quite well. Are you? Because you have become quite the recluse, and people are beginning to notice. Eleanor brushed dirt from her hands. What people notice or do not notice is of little consequence to me. My dear, I say this with affection, you cannot simply disappear. Why not? The question emerged more bluntly than Eleanor intended. What function do I serve by continuing to appear at gatherings where I am neither needed nor particularly wanted? I am sensible, steady, useful for advice. But I am not missed when I am absent, Lady Pemberton. I am simply replaced by whoever stands nearest when someone needs an opinion on embroidery or sympathy about a daughter's marriage prospects. Lady Pemberton looked genuinely taken aback. That is not true. It is entirely true. And I do not say it with bitterness, merely with clarity. I have my place in society, and it is a small one, and I have decided it does not require my constant attendance. But you enjoy society. You always have. Had she? Eleanor was no longer certain. Perhaps she had enjoyed the idea of society, the hope that somewhere in all those drawing rooms and ballrooms she might find something that felt like belonging. But belonging was for people who fit. And Eleanor had quietly, irrevocably ceased to fit. I enjoy my garden more, she said simply. Lady Pemberton studied her for a long moment. Then, with uncharacteristic gentleness, has something happened? Has someone said something unkind? No one has said anything unkind. Everyone has been exceptionally kind. That is rather the problem. She did not elaborate. Lady Pemberton would not understand, and Eleanor had no desire to explain how kindness could be its own form of erasure. After Lady Pemberton departed, still worried, still puzzled, still convinced Eleanor was making some sort of mistake, Eleanor returned to her herbs. She dead-headed the lavender with methodical precision, removing what had already bloomed to make space for new growth. That evening, she made a decision. She would not return to society. Not this season, perhaps not ever. She would sell the London house eventually, find something smaller in the country where the cost of living would match her modest means. She would keep her garden. Perhaps expand it. She had always wanted a proper greenhouse. She would make a life that did not require youth or beauty or social relevance. A life measured in growing seasons rather than marriage seasons. It was not the life she had once imagined. But imagination, she had learned, was a luxury afforded to women who still believed they had choices. Eleanor had dignity instead. And dignity required knowing when to stop hoping for what would never arrive. She wrote to Lady Thornton, declining her invitation to next month's garden party. Then to Mrs. Aldridge, explaining she would not be available for tea. Then to the subscription committee for the botanical lectures, cancelling her membership. Each letter felt like closing a door. Not slamming it, Eleanor would never slam, but closing it quietly, firmly, with the certainty that she would not be reopening it. She told herself this was strength. Self-preservation. The wisdom that came with age and experience. She told herself she was not running away. She was simply done waiting for a life that had clearly moved on without her. What Eleanor did not know, what she could not know, having removed herself so completely from observation, was that her absence had created a space. And that space was being felt. Not by everyone. Most of society had absorbed her withdrawal the way water absorbs a single drop of rain, seamlessly, without measurable impact. But one person had noticed. One person had begun arriving at gatherings and remaining too long, as though waiting for something. One person had begun asking careful, casual questions about her whereabouts. One person had stood in ballrooms and drawing rooms with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some things could not be rushed but only waited for. Eleanor did not know any of this. She only knew that she had finally learned the lesson society had been teaching her for years, that her time had passed, that her presence was optional, that the world would continue turning beautifully without her. She had learned to stop hoping. She had learned to stop attending. She had learned to stop believing that perhaps meant anything more than a polite word offered into silence. And in learning all of this, she had accidentally done something she did not intend. She had made a man who never chased begin to realize what it meant to want something that had quietly, completely, disappeared. Eleanor was in her garden when she heard the knock. Not at the front door, her housekeeper would have managed that, but at the garden gate. The small wooden door that opened onto the mews behind her house and was never used except by tradesmen who had lost their way. She looked up from the rosemary she was trimming, secateurs still in hand, and felt her heart perform some complicated maneuver she had thought herself too old for. The Duke of Ashcombe stood at her garden gate. He was dressed for riding. His boots were dusty. His coat was perfectly tailored but showed signs of actual use rather than mere display. He looked, Eleanor thought with some distant part of her mind, like a man who had been somewhere other than drawing rooms. "Your Grace." She set down the secateurs with hands that wanted to tremble. "I was not expecting visitors. I apologize for the intrusion. Your housekeeper informed me you were in the garden and suggested I might, that is," she indicated the gate. "Mrs. Harrison." Eleanor would have words with her later. Assuming she survived whatever this was. "How may I help you?" The formality felt absurd given that she was standing in dirt-stained gloves with her hair pinned in a manner that could charitably be called haphazard. But formality was all she had. "May I come in?" It was not really a question. Or rather, it was a question he had already answered by opening the gate and stepping through it. Eleanor gestured vaguely toward the small iron bench near the wall. "Please." He did not sit. Neither did she. They stood in her modest garden, barely 15 feet square, bounded by brick walls and containing more ambition than actual beauty, and looked at each other with the particular intensity of two people who had been carefully not looking at each other for weeks. "You have been absent from society," he said finally. "I have." "May I ask why?" Eleanor felt something sharp and hot rise in her chest. "I was not aware my attendance was required, Your Grace." "It is not required. I am simply curious about your reasons." "My reasons are my own." "Of course." He paused. "Lady Pemberton believes you are unwell." "Lady Pemberton is kind but incorrect. Mrs. Aldridge thinks you have grown tired of society." Mrs. Aldridge is closer to the truth. Another pause. Longer this time. The Duke looked at her garden, really looked at it, his gaze moving across the herbs and the few flowers she had coaxed into bloom. You have lavender, he observed. Yes. And thyme. Rosemary. You have created a practical garden. I prefer things that serve a purpose, as opposed to things that merely ornament. Precisely. He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected. Then he turned to face her fully, and Eleanor saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Not warmth, exactly. Not even emotion. But something beneath the careful control. Something that looked almost like uncertainty. Miss Fairleigh, I must ask you something, and I require an honest answer. Her heart was doing that complicated thing again. Very well. Have I given you offense? The question was so unexpected that Eleanor nearly laughed. Offense? No, Your Grace. You have been nothing but courteous. Then why have you withdrawn? I told you. I have grown tired of. Please. The single word cut through her deflection with surgical precision. I am asking for honesty, Miss Fairleigh. I believe I have earned at least that. Earned. As though he had claim to her honesty. As though his careful observations and his remembered details and his perhaps created some sort of debt. Eleanor felt anger stir. Real anger, not the polite frustration she usually allowed herself. You want honesty. Very well. I withdrew because I was tired of being useful. Tired of being sensible and steady and consulted for advice while being utterly irrelevant in every way that matters. Tired of watching younger women be chosen while I am patted on the hand and told how dignified I am in my acceptance. She was speaking too quickly now, words spilling out before she could properly restrain them. And I was tired of mistaking courtesy for something it was not. So I removed myself from situations where I might continue to make that mistake. The Duke's expression had not changed. What mistake did you make? It does not matter. It matters to me. Why? The word emerged too loud, too raw. Why would it possibly matter to you, Your Grace? You have Miss Hartfield and any number of suitable young women who would be delighted by your attention. My presence or absence should be entirely inconsequential to you. Should be, he agreed quietly. And yet it is not. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. Please do not do this. Do what? Offer kindness disguised as interest. I cannot, her voice fractured. She steadied it through sheer will. I am too old to be pitied, Your Grace. Pitied. He repeated the word as though tasting something bitter. You believe I pity you. What else would you call it? Recognition. The word hung between them like something physical. The Duke took a single step closer. Not close enough to be improper. Close enough that Eleanor had to look up to meet his eyes. I noticed you first, Miss Fairleigh. She stared at him. I beg your pardon. Before the library at Hartfield House. Before the botanical lecture. Before any of the small moments you catalogued and then dismissed as courtesy, I noticed you. 3 seasons ago, at Lady Pemberton's garden party. You were standing alone near the roses, and Lord Blackwood approached you with some question about poetry. You answered him with such precision, such clarity, and he walked away without ever seeing what I saw. Which was that you had given him exactly what he needed while revealing nothing of what you needed. The Duke's voice remained level, but something beneath it had shifted. That you had made yourself useful while making yourself invisible. And I thought, he paused. I thought, here is someone who has learned to protect herself by never asking for anything. Eleanor could not speak, could not move. I waited, he continued, because I believed time had already taken enough from you. Because society had already decided you were finished, and I would not contribute to that injustice by approaching you when any attention from a man of my station would only invite speculation about your desperation or my charity. So you did nothing. I did nothing that could harm you. He said it as though it were obvious, as though she should have understood. I remained where you were. I remembered what you said. I offered perhaps when I wanted to offer certainty because certainty would have required you to hope, and hope is dangerous for women whom society has already dismissed. Eleanor felt tears threaten. She refused them. And Miss Hartfield was positioned as my match by people who believe suitability is measured in years and dowries. His expression hardened slightly. I have been polite to Miss Hartfield because she deserves politeness. I have never encouraged her because I have no interest in encouraging her. Everyone believes. Everyone believes what they wish to believe. I cannot control society's assumptions. I can only control my own actions. He paused. Which is why I am here. I could not let you disappear believing I had never seen you. The silence that followed felt enormous, fragile, like something that might shatter if either of them breathed too hard. You should not have come, Eleanor said finally, quietly. This changes nothing. Does it not? I am still too old. Society will still dismiss. Society, the Duke interrupted with unexpected force, has dismissed me as cold and unreachable for 15 years. I learned long ago to stop caring what society thinks I should be. His gaze held hers. The question is whether you care. Whether I care what society thinks. Whether you care that I noticed you first. That I have been waiting. That I am here, in your garden, telling you what I should perhaps have told you weeks ago if I had been less careful and more courageous. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She clasped them together. Why are you telling me this now? Because you disappeared. And I realized that all my care, all my patience, all my deliberate waiting had accomplished nothing except making you believe you were not seen. Something that might have been regret crossed his features. I thought I was protecting you. I did not realize I was simply teaching you to protect yourself from me. Your Grace. Nathaniel. She blinked. What? My name is Nathaniel, and I would very much like you to use it. Not today, perhaps. Not until you are ready. But eventually, I would like to hear my name in your voice, Eleanor. He had used her name, her Christian name, in her garden, without permission, without preamble. It should have been improper. It should have been presumptuous. It felt like the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. I do not know what you want from me, she whispered. Time, he said simply. I want time with you. Conversations that are not accidental. Silences that are chosen rather than merely tolerated. I want to stop waiting at a distance and start waiting beside you, if you will permit it. People will talk. Let them. They will say terrible things. They already say I am impossible to know and you are past consideration. What worse things remain? Eleanor felt a laugh try to escape. It came out as something closer to a sob. This is madness. Perhaps. He tilted his head slightly. Or perhaps it is simply the first honest thing either of us has done in months. She looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who had rearranged his schedule around her absence. Who had remembered alpine flora and inferior refreshments. Who had stood in ballrooms waiting for someone who had stopped coming. I thought you had chosen Georgiana. I know. I thought I had misunderstood everything. I know that too. His voice gentled. And that is my fault. I was so busy protecting you from hope that I never considered you might need hope to protect yourself from despair. I do not despair. Do you not? He glanced at her garden. At the practical herbs and the modest space. At the life she was building for herself in careful, deliberate solitude. This is a garden for someone who has stopped expecting visitors, Eleanor. She could not argue with that. She would not lie to him. Not now. Not after this. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, I leave. Because I have taken enough of your time uninvited, and because you need to think without my presence pressuring your thoughts. He moved toward the gate, then paused. But I will call on you tomorrow. Properly. With flowers and proper notice. And if you agree to see me, we will have a conversation that is not accidental. And if I do not agree? He looked at her with those unreadable eyes that suddenly seemed very readable indeed. Then I will wait. Again. As long as necessary. But this time, you will know I am waiting. And that will have to be enough. He left. The gate clicked shut behind him. Eleanor stood in her garden, dirt under her nails, tears on her face, hope in her chest. Dangerous, terrible hope. The kind that could destroy her. The kind she had promised herself she would never feel again. And yet there it was. Blooming like lavender in her practical garden, unbidden and impossible to uproot. The flowers arrived precisely at 11 o'clock the next morning. Not roses, which would have been traditional. Not lilies, which would have been formal. Alpine wildflowers, carefully preserved and arranged with obvious thought, accompanied by a card that read simply, Volume 3. As promised. N. Eleanor held the card for a long time before setting it carefully on her writing desk. Mrs. Harrison appeared in the doorway with barely concealed excitement. Will you be receiving His Grace when he calls this afternoon, miss? I will. Shall I prepare tea? Yes. Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. The housekeeper's smile could have illuminated the room. Eleanor suspected that by evening, half of London would know the Duke of Ashcombe had sent flowers to Miss Eleanor Fairleigh's residence. By the following morning, all of London would know. She was correct. Lady Pemberton arrived before the Duke did, slightly breathless and visibly concerned. Eleanor, dear, I have just heard the most extraordinary rumor. Have you? They are saying the Duke sent you flowers. Alpine flowers, of all things. It is not a rumor, Lady Pemberton. It is a fact. Lady Pemberton sat down without being invited. My dear, I must speak plainly. Are you certain this is wise? Receiving flowers. Encouraging the Duke's attentions. Lady Pemberton's expression was genuinely worried. I know you have always been fond of him, and he is certainly eligible, but people are already talking, and what they are saying is not kind. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are they saying? That you have cleverly positioned yourself as some sort of, forgive me, intellectual companion. That you have taken advantage of his reserved nature to insinuate yourself into his confidence while younger, more suitable women were overlooked. I see. They are saying, Lady Pemberton continued, clearly distressed by having to repeat such things, that a woman of your age should know better than to encourage a man who could have his choice of any young lady in London. That it is unseemly. The word landed like a slap. Unseemly. Not wrong or immoral or cruel. Simply inappropriate for someone who should know her place. And what does Miss Hartfield say? Eleanor asked quietly. Miss Hartfield is devastated, naturally. Lady Hartfield is furious. She had been led to believe, that is, everyone assumed, that he would choose someone suitable. Well, yes. Lady Pemberton reached across to touch Eleanor's hand. I am not saying their cruelty is justified. I am simply saying that society can be brutal to women who appear to be reaching above their station, and you must protect yourself. By refusing the Duke's call. By being cautious. By considering whether his interest, however flattering, is worth the scrutiny it will bring. After Lady Pemberton departed, still worried, still convinced Eleanor was making a terrible mistake, Eleanor sat in her drawing-room and considered whether she had the strength for what was coming. She was under no illusions. Society had tolerated her when she was invisible. It would not tolerate her if she became visible in the wrong way. If she became an example of ambition overreaching. A cautionary tale about women who forgot their age and their place. The Duke arrived at 2 o'clock. Mrs. Harrison showed him into the drawing-room with such obvious approval that Eleanor felt a rush of affection for her meddling housekeeper. Miss Fairleigh. He bowed with his customary precision. Your Grace. Thank you for the flowers. They are beautiful. I am glad they pleased you. He remained standing until she gestured for him to sit. Even then, he chose the chair across from her rather than beside her. Proper distance. Always proper. They talked. Not about anything of consequence at first. The weather. A book she had been reading. His recent estate business. The conversation was careful, measured, and underneath it all ran a current of something Eleanor did not have words for. He stayed exactly 30 minutes. When he rose to leave, he paused. May I call on you again tomorrow? Your Grace, Nathaniel, I must ask you something first. He waited. Have you heard what people are saying? I have. And it does not concern you. It concerns me that they are saying it to you. About you. His expression hardened slightly. It does not concern me that they are saying it at all. I expected no less. They believe I have manipulated you somehow. That I am taking advantage of your regard through cleverness or calculation. I know what they believe. I do not share their belief. Eleanor stood. This required standing. They also believe that a man of your station could have his choice of any woman in London. And they are correct. You could choose Miss Hartfield or Miss Astley or any number of lovely, young, suitable women who would not bring scrutiny or speculation to your name. I could, he agreed. I do not wish to. You say that now. I will say it tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that, for as long as necessary until you believe I am saying it because it is true rather than because it is convenient. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Nathaniel, I will not let you ruin your reputation for me. You will not let me. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. Eleanor, I am 38 years old. I have managed my own reputation for 2 decades without assistance. I do not require your permission to risk it now. You do not understand what they will say. What they will do. I understand perfectly. They will say I am bewitched. That I have lost my judgment. That I am experiencing some sort of crisis that requires intervention. He took a single step closer. And I will ignore them with the same practiced indifference I have ignored every other opinion about how I should live my life. Lady Hartfield is furious. Lady Hartfield will recover. Miss Hartfield is heartbroken. Miss Hartfield was never encouraged. Her heartbreak, if it exists, is based on expectations I did nothing to create and everything to discourage. His voice remained level, but steel threaded through it. I will not accept responsibility for disappointment I took every measure to prevent. Eleanor shook her head. You do not see how this will follow you. How it will color every interaction, every business dealing, every... Eleanor. He said her name with such quiet finality that she stopped. I am asking you to let me make my own choices. Even if they are difficult. Even if they cost me something. You have spent your entire life making yourself smaller so others could be comfortable. Do not ask me to do the same. The words struck something deep. Some truth she had been avoiding. I am trying to protect you, she whispered. I know. And I am grateful for your concern. But I do not need protection from my own decisions. He moved toward the door, then turned back. What I need is for you to trust that I have considered the cost and found it acceptable. That I am choosing you not despite society's objection but in complete awareness of it. After he left, Eleanor sat in silence for a long time. Mrs. Aldridge called that evening. Then Mrs. Devon. Both with variations of the same message. Be careful, be cautious, consider the consequences. Lord Blackwood sent a note, kind, concerned, suggesting she might wish to reconsider before things went too far. Even Miss Caroline Astley, sweet and genuine, wrote to express her worry. I only want you to be happy, Miss Fairleigh, but I would hate to see you hurt by gossip that cannot be controlled. Everyone was worried for her. Everyone wanted to protect her. Everyone assumed she needed protection from her own poor judgment. Only Nathaniel had assumed she was capable of making her own choice and living with it. That night, Eleanor wrote 2 letters. The first was to Lady Hartfield. An apology for any distress caused, though Eleanor was careful not to apologize for Nathaniel's attentions themselves. She had done nothing wrong. She would not pretend otherwise. The second was to Nathaniel. Brief. Honest. You may call tomorrow. And the day after. For as long as you wish. I will not protect you from yourself any longer. But I reserve the right to be terrified of what this will cost us both. E. She sealed both letters before she could reconsider. Sent them before dawn, when courage was fragile and easily lost. By the time Nathaniel received his letter, London society had already sharpened its knives. The gossip had moved from speculation to certainty. Miss Fairleigh had ensnared the Duke. The Duke had lost his senses. It was tragic, really. Concerning. Someone should intervene. Lady Hartfield made her feelings abundantly clear at Lady Pemberton's card party, where Eleanor's absence was noted and discussed with barely concealed satisfaction. Some women, Lady Hartfield announced to the room at large, mistake a man's politeness for partiality. It is unfortunate when such delusions lead to public embarrassment. Quite unfortunate, Mrs. Pemberton agreed, though her tone suggested less certainty than her words. One must feel sorry for His Grace. To be pursued so obviously by someone so clearly unsuitable. Miss Lydia Aldridge, to her credit, spoke up quietly. Miss Fairleigh has never pursued anyone. She is the most dignified woman I know. Dignity, Lady Hartfield said coldly, is knowing when one is no longer in consideration. The words would reach Eleanor eventually. They always did. Words like that had a way of finding their target. But Eleanor had made her choice. She would not step away to make others comfortable, would not disappear to preserve someone else's expectation of how her life should look. She had spent 37 years being sensible, being careful, being appropriate. For once, perhaps for the only time that mattered, she would be foolish enough to hope. Even if hope destroyed her. Even if society was right and she was wrong and this entire thing collapsed into humiliation. At least she would have chosen it herself. At least she would have been seen. The Wycliffe's ball was the event of the season. Everyone who mattered would attend. Which was precisely why Eleanor had declined the invitation. She had no desire to provide entertainment for people who had already decided she was either pitiable or calculating. Let them speculate in her absence. She had grown comfortable with absence. Nathaniel had other ideas. He arrived at her house 3 hours before the ball, properly announced, properly formal. Mrs. Harrison showed him into the drawing-room with an expression that suggested she knew something Eleanor did not. "You declined the Wycliffe's invitation," he said without preamble. "I did." "May I ask why?" Eleanor set down her book. "Because I have no wish to be examined like a specimen under glass while people debate whether I have manipulated you or you have lost your faculties." "I see." He remained standing. "And if I asked you to reconsider?" "I would ask why you wish to subject us both to scrutiny we could easily avoid." "Because avoiding scrutiny is not the same as resolving it." He moved closer, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I did not wait months to conduct a courtship in your drawing-room while society speculates outside. I will not hide what I feel because others disapprove of it." "What you feel," Eleanor repeated carefully. "You have not named what you feel." "Have I not?" Something shifted in his expression. "I have sent flowers. Called daily. Ignored every suggestion that I am making a mistake. What have I not named?" "The word itself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, "I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since I watched you explain poetry to Lord Blackwood 3 seasons ago and realized you were the only person in that room who understood that being useful and being valued are not the same thing." He paused. "Is that named enough for you?" Eleanor could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at this man who never explained himself, who never offered more than necessary, who had just offered everything. "You do not have to say it back," he continued. "Not tonight. Not until you are certain. But I need you to come to this ball with me. I need society to see that I am choosing you publicly, deliberately, and without reservation. They will be cruel. Let them. They will say terrible things. They are already saying terrible things. The only question is whether we allow their words to control our actions." He extended his hand. "Come with me tonight. Let me show you what it looks like when a man stops waiting at a distance and starts claiming what he wants." Eleanor looked at his hand, at the man attached to it, at the choice he was offering. She thought of every time she had made herself smaller, every time she had withdrawn to avoid causing discomfort, every time she had protected others from having to acknowledge her wants. She thought of her garden, of the life she had been building in careful solitude. And then she thought of alpine flora and remembered details and perhaps becoming certainty. She took his hand. "I will need time to dress appropriately." Something that might have been relief crossed his features. "I will wait. I have become rather good at waiting." 2 hours later, Eleanor descended her stairs in a gown of deep sapphire blue, not the sage or grey she usually wore, but something that demanded attention rather than apologizing for taking it. Mrs. Harrison had helped with her hair, pinning it in a style that framed her face rather than hiding it. She looked, Eleanor realized with some surprise, beautiful. Not young. Not trying to appear young. Simply beautiful in the way a woman of 37 could be beautiful when she stopped apologizing for existing. Nathaniel's expression when he saw her confirmed what she barely dared believe. The carriage ride to the Wycliffes was silent. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that existed between two people who had said what needed saying and were gathering strength for what came next. When they arrived, the butler's announcement carried through the ballroom like a thunderclap. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe. Miss Eleanor Fairleigh." The room did not fall silent. That only happened in novels. But conversation faltered. Heads turned. Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on her like a physical thing. Nathaniel's hand tightened briefly on her arm. Not nervously. Reassuringly. They descended the stairs together. Lady Wycliffe recovered first, sweeping forward with the determination of a hostess who would not allow awkwardness at her own ball. "Your Grace, Miss Fairleigh. What a pleasure to have you both." Other guests approached. Some with genuine warmth. Some with barely concealed curiosity. Lord Wycliffe engaged Nathaniel in conversation about some parliamentary matter. Eleanor found herself temporarily alone, acutely aware that she was being observed from every corner of the room. Lady Hartfield stood near the refreshment table with Georgiana, both watching with expressions Eleanor could not quite read. Mrs. Aldridge hovered nearby with Lydia, clearly uncertain whether to approach. Lady Pemberton looked worried. Eleanor lifted her chin. She had done nothing wrong. She would not behave as though she had. The music began. Nathaniel returned to her side. "Will you dance with me, Eleanor?" It was not the first dance, that would have been too presumptuous. But it was the second, which was significant enough. Yes. He led her onto the floor. As they took their positions, Eleanor was aware of the whispers, the stares, the speculation. She was also aware of Nathaniel's steady presence beside her. The dance began. He moved with the same measured precision he brought to everything. Eleanor had forgotten how much she enjoyed dancing when her partner actually saw her. "You are being remarkably brave," he said quietly as they turned. "I am terrified." "Good. So am I." She looked at him in surprise. "You are never afraid." "I am frequently afraid. I simply do not show it." He met her gaze. But I am showing you now. Because you deserve to know that this matters to me. That you matter to me. That I am choosing to be afraid with you rather than safe without you. The dance continued. Other couples joined the floor, reducing the scrutiny marginally. When the music ended, Nathaniel did not immediately release her hand. There is something I need to say. Publicly. Eleanor's heart stuttered. Nathaniel. Trust me. He led her to the edge of the ballroom where Lord and Lady Wycliffe stood with a cluster of guests. As they approached, conversation faltered again. Nathaniel did not seem to notice or, more accurately, did not care. Lord Wycliffe, Lady Wycliffe, I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for a moment. Lady Wycliffe looked intrigued. Of course, Your Grace. A small crowd had gathered. Eleanor recognized faces, Lady Pemberton, Mrs. Aldridge, Lord Blackwood, even Lady Hartfield watching from a distance with tight-lipped disapproval. Nathaniel turned to face them, still holding Eleanor's hand. I am aware, he said, his voice carrying with unexpected authority, that my courtship of Miss Fairleigh has prompted considerable speculation. I am also aware that much of that speculation has been unkind to a woman who has shown me nothing but dignity, intelligence, and grace. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. I would like to make my intentions clear. I am courting Miss Fairleigh because she is the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Not despite her age, but inclusive of it. She possesses depth of character that comes only from experience, wisdom that cannot be taught, and the kind of quiet strength that society consistently undervalues. Eleanor felt tears threaten. She refused them. Society measures women by their youth and men by their achievement. I choose to measure worth differently. Miss Fairleigh's worth is not diminished by time. It is enhanced by it. She has learned patience without bitterness, acceptance without resignation, and how to offer grace to a world that has given her precious little in return. He turned to look at Eleanor. And if society finds my choice unsuitable, society may adjust its expectations. Because I will not adjust mine. He said it without anger, without defensiveness, simply as fact. Lady Pemberton was the first to move. She stepped forward and took Eleanor's free hand. Your Grace is quite right. We have all been fools not to see what was obvious. Mrs. Aldridge joined her. Miss Fairleigh has always been exceptional. We simply forgot to notice. Lord Blackwood nodded. Here, here. Not everyone looked convinced. Lady Hartfield remained stony-faced. Several younger women whispered behind fans. But the moment had shifted. The possibility had been named. The expectation had been challenged. Nathaniel turned back to Eleanor. May I have the next dance as well? That would be highly improper, Your Grace. I am aware. He smiled then. Barely, but unmistakably. Will you dance with me anyway? Yes. They danced 3 more times that evening. Which was excessive. Which was noticed. Which was precisely the point. When Nathaniel finally returned Eleanor to her home well after midnight, he walked her to her door and took her hand once more. Thank you, he said quietly, for being brave enough to be seen. Thank you for seeing me. I have always seen you, Eleanor. I am simply relieved I finally said so publicly. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, proper, restrained, and somehow more intimate than anything else that had happened that evening. May I call on you tomorrow? You may call on me every day, if you wish. I do wish. He released her hand reluctantly. Sleep well, Eleanor. You as well, Nathaniel. She watched him return to his carriage. Watched the carriage roll away into darkness. Then she went inside, where Mrs. Harrison was waiting with tea and barely suppressed excitement. Eleanor did not sleep well. But for once, it was not anxiety keeping her awake. It was peace. Not the peace of resignation. Not the peace of having given up hope. The peace of being chosen. Publicly. Deliberately. by a man who saw her completely and wanted her anyway. Society would adjust. Or it would not. Either way, Eleanor discovered she no longer cared as much as she thought she would. She had been seen. She had been named. She had been claimed. And she had claimed something for herself, the right to be loved not despite who she was, but because of it. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Ending. 6 months had passed since the Wycliffe's ball. The gossip had eventually quieted, replaced by new scandals and fresh speculation. Society had adjusted, as Nathaniel promised it would, though not without resistance. Eleanor had married the Duke of Ashcombe in a small ceremony at his family chapel. No grand spectacle. No performance for people who had spent years dismissing her. Just vows exchanged between two people who had learned that love was not about being perfect, but about being recognized. Now she stood in the greenhouse at Ashcombe Hall, the one Nathaniel had built for her as a wedding gift, surrounded by alpine flora that bloomed impossibly in English soil. Volume 3 of the Botanical Illustrations sat open on the work table, its pages worn from frequent reference. She heard footsteps behind her. Knew them without turning. "You have been out here for hours," Nathaniel observed. The primrose was struggling. "I had to adjust the drainage." He moved beside her, examining her work with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "And did you save it?" "I believe so. Time will tell." Time usually does. They stood together in comfortable silence. Not the silence of strangers but of two people who had learned that love did not require constant performance. That presence was enough. That patience was its own form of devotion. Nathaniel reached for her hand. A gesture so familiar now that Eleanor barely registered it, except she registered it every time. The choosing. The continuous choosing. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. Eleanor considered the question. Considered the garden she was building, the life they were creating, the way he still waited for her, not at a distance anymore, but beside her. "Yes," she said simply. "I am happy." They once said she was past her prime. But he knew, he had always known, she had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to see her. And in seeing her, he had given her something society never could. Not rescue, not salvation, not even completion. Just recognition. Just love. Just enough. They once said she was past her prime. But he knew, she had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to see her. Some loves are never spoken of. Others are remembered. If these tales have touched your heart today, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our circle. It costs nothing to join us, but to a creator, your presence means the world. Without your support, these stories remain unheard, and no passion should ever go to waste. Turn on notifications so we may continue this journey together, and share this video with someone who needs a little romance in their life. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which part of the story stayed with you the longest? Stay tuned for another powerful tale appearing on your screen now. Let yourself be swept away once more. With love, the Lord Whistledown Romance Tales team.